Hello and welcome back to another edition of DEMA Live. Today is a special edition as we're live on site at the office of David Stanislaw. David has been working with the Domestic Estate Managers Association over the last year and has had an opportunity to interview several of our estate managers that are members of the association about some of the different conflicts and ways to resolve those conflicts in a very professional manner. So with that being said, I'd like to introduce David. Hi David, how are you today?
Doing well, man.
Fantastic. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to spend with our members over the last year. I know you've made some phone calls to some of our members and talked with them a little bit about some of the conflicts that they've seen, and I think that we've had some interesting results.
I agree. Being able to talk with many of your managers around the country has really informed me as to some of the difficulties that many of them have run into and some of the problems they've ended up having to cope with. One of the realities, I think, is that most people approach the subject of conflict with a great deal of fear and trepidation. They simply work to avoid it. One of the things that I feel very strongly about is that conflict is a very useful tool, and that being angry, being upset are not necessarily negative or bad things. In the end, it's a part of us as human beings that we from time to time feel angry or frustrated. The reality of what we do with it is really what matters.
Okay, all right, great. So how does one handle that fear and trepidation that we have when it comes time to handle a conflict? What's the best way that you've seen to really resolve that?
Well, the best tool I think we have is the ability to look inward and think about what it means to us to be involved in a conflict situation. For example, many times we're reacting out of the fear that the conflict is going to escalate into something that is unmanageable or just plain scary. The reality is that very few of us as adults have encountered those kinds of situations. So what we need to consider is, let's look at the reality of what we've experienced as adults and allow us to think about the idea that conflict, people getting angry, me getting angry, is not such a catastrophic event. Instead, it's a signal. Something is going on that's very important, that has got me emotionally charged up. And now the question is, what is it about and what do I want to do with it?
Okay.
It's imperative that we have the ability to think about these things instead of reacting with emotion. Primarily, we end up reacting with either fear or anger.
Okay. So what do you think from an estate manager's perspective, some of the interviews that you've had, what have you seen, from your perspective? Obviously your recommendation would be to step away from the situation, think about how you're going to resolve it, but in the situation of an estate manager, sometimes you can't do that. What would be the best way for an estate manager to handle that from your perspective if it's a situation where you can't avoid the heat of the moment, so to speak?
Well, the heat of the moment isn't necessarily all bad.
Okay.
I think it really depends on a person's comfort with the amount of, if you will, aggression or anger that's in the air. Stepping away is always good for a person who has to give themselves a little bit of time and space emotionally to kind of contend with what's going on inside. And typically, again, it's fear and or anger that they're contending with.
Right.
If at the moment a person's comfortable dealing with somebody, let's say the owner of the estate, who's angry at something that's happened or they believe has happened, ideally the best moment to really deal with that is when it's really hot, assuming that one can move to a rational level fairly soon. If it's not possible, then it is best to go into a cool-off situation and not to resume discussing the conflict until both parties say, I'm ready.
Okay, all right. So what are some of the things that you found interesting in the phone discussions and interviews that you have with our estate managers regarding the conflict situations that you discussed over the phone?
Well, I think the primary thing that I was struck with was the difference in relationships between some of the estate managers and the owners of the estates. For many of them, they ended up having a very good relationship where a problem came up that each of them could recognize either individually, but they could sit down together and develop solutions that were effective and were really fully bought into by both parties.
Mm-hmm.
However, many estate managers reported having had very poor relationships with their owners. And that's very troubling because, among other things, it doesn't give a floor of trust and what we call relationship that can be built on in dealing with a troublesome situation. And many of those situations end up leading to some of the real difficulties that these managers have not been able to solve well, and in a few instances have led to their being fired fairly quickly.
Mm-hmm. And how would you suggest that trust is built? I mean, obviously, there's a fine line between boundaries between a principal and their in-home staff. What's your recommendation? Obviously, with the discussions that you've had, you've been able to develop some type of idea regarding that. How would you recommend building that trust between the two sides?
Well, I think there are two aspects that I'd suggest may be very helpful. The primary tool is the relationship. If you can have a relationship with your principal or owner of the estate that is cordial, businesslike, and what I'm going to say is really very friendly,
Mm-hmm.
then you end up being able to potentially have the ability, when difficulties are encountered, and it's only a question of when, it's not if,
Right.
that you have something that really you can fall back on that will allow you to address this with that person. The second piece of it, I think, is to take a position with your principal of being a bit deferential. That is, don't take the position, I need you to do this with your principal, but rather a position more like, what can I do to make this work better for you and for the entire estate?
Mm-hmm.
I, as the estate manager, want to serve you well. I want to do well in terms of managing your property, and I need for you to give me feedback and help me do it well.
Okay.
So if a person really invites that, they end up creating what I'm going to call as a greater level of trust and intimacy with their boss, should that person be capable of doing it.
Okay, so it's almost like you're opening yourself up and asking them to provide a solution to that particular conflict.
Either, provide a solution or mutually collaborate to develop a solution.
Okay.
My experience is that generally the more minds, up to a certain number, involved in solving a problem, generally the better the solution is going to be.
Okay.
Not just because the solution is better, but the buy-in is greater.
Okay. What other situations did you uncover while doing the interviews with these estate managers that you thought were interesting?
Well, I think some of them really revolved around dealing with staff as well as outside vendors.
Okay.
And very frequently, I mean, people like to use the catchphrase, problems in communication, which I think is often true. But underlying that is often a difference in attitude, respect, trust, and really a common mission. Some vendors are very dollar-oriented and not so service-oriented.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, estate managers are looking to utilize dollars in a frugal way, and they want a certain quality of service.
Right.
And so the reality is we end up in a situation where there's a clash. And while it appears to be a communication, it really is the underlying motivation between each of the parties involved.
Okay. So almost like setting the guidelines before anything is done when it comes to the work that's going to be done in the estate.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There should be a common purpose that's set forth. And sometimes we know that that's very easily established because we start out, in a similar place.
Okay.
Other times we have to work at it.
Right, and I think that's a great point. Is I think a lot of times from a vendor's perspective, there's not that communication of here's the end result that we're looking for. But in the meantime, how do you get to that end result? There's so many steps in between coming into a home that have to be monitored and regulated. And I think that what you're saying is set those guidelines from the very beginning, that I want you to enter the estate from the backside of the house. I want you to wear booties. I want you to have a walk-off mat. All of those things that the estate manager would like to see. But if they don't communicate it, that's going to cause conflict.
And it depends on how it's communicated.
Right.
You know, if the estate manager is looking down and talking down to a particular vendor, you know, that's likely to begin the process in a very, very difficult way.
Okay.
People like to be treated with respect, and they're really entitled, you know, to that. If you're hiring a service, chances are you feel that that service is going to be beneficial to you.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality is it's a partnership.
Okay. All right. So it's working together to accomplish an end goal.
Exactly.
Okay. Great.
Well, I think there are a number of things that some of the estate managers reported to me. I like the idea of having a clear understanding. One of the difficulties in relying on legal documents alone is that they tend to be real crisp and formal. And ultimately, I think the most significant part of what happens between an estate manager and a principal will be the personal relationship that they develop together. And so more than anything, I think there needs to be, and I'm going to call it this, an emotional agreement between the two individuals involved and or the other members of the family
right.
of the estate owner, to be able to really develop a sense of trust and common understanding, and the ability to move into talking about the tough things that come up in a more intimate setting. You know, as you know, I spent the early part of my career as a psychotherapist,
okay.
and dealing with internal conflicts as well as interpersonal conflicts in both, you know, marital treatment as well as in group therapy. It's terribly important that we sit in the middle of conflict and not be frightened to death of it.
Right.
The reality is a conflict doesn't usually bite. And the reality is once there's a good relationship between two people, most things can be worked out satisfactorily.
Okay, great. If anyone wants to contact you, what's the best way to reach out and contact you for more information regarding how to handle conflict resolution in other areas?
Well, there are several ways, and I would suggest that either my website, which is stanislawconsulting.com, or my toll-free number, which is 866-222-7272, would be ways to reach out. And I would encourage people to think about reaching out early in the conflict developing process.
Okay.
Conflict is something that people tend to avoid and hang on to.
Right.
And unlike fine wine, it ferments in an ugly way and tends never to get better. So questions, ideas, thoughts about it, mulled over, thought over, talked over early, tend to be the best way to provide the widest range of options, you know, for the people involved.
Great. And for those of you that don't know as members, and for our members, could you explain a little bit more, besides just the conflict resolution, some of the other opportunities that you can provide to our members?
Yes, I work with a lot of medium and small businesses, principally around the area of what we call organizational development and people development. We do a great deal of work with companies that are growing. We work with a number of companies that are troubled and are having difficulty managing complex internal conflictual problems. And we're pretty successful in helping people hire really top-level employees because we use a combination of online tools as well as direct internal interviews with people. Okay. And we utilize the expertise of all the people in the company.
Great, great. Well, I appreciate you taking the time with us today. I'm sure that this is only one of many interviews that we'll have sit-downs regarding, and I'm sure there'll be some other situations. Maybe next time what we'll do is we'll have some write-in questions from some of our members and have you answer those on what your recommendation would be, if that would be okay with you.
Sure, that'd be fun.
All right, sounds great. We hope that you've enjoyed today's interview with David Stanislaw. We look forward to talking with David once again in future DEMA Live interviews. And just wanted to personally reach out and thank you, David, for your time.
My pleasure. Good to be
And
with you, Matt.
absolutely, we appreciate having you. And for any of you that would like to reach out to him, obviously, please do that on his website. And until next time, we will see you and we'll talk to you soon.